This is Brian Price, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Come on. Look, Brian's a badass dude. First off, he's got a hat for a program that we worked in. We went to war together. And so we're going to talk about that more next week. But I just want to let you know, Brian is a badass in the modern sense in that he will take his books, his notebook, and he'll go into a combat zone and he'll come back smiling and smarter. So he is the kind of guy I love. And we've been friends for, gosh, Brian, it's a long time now. It's over 10 years.
It is, yeah. A full decade.
I know. And anytime you've known someone for a decade, and we've maintained pretty good contact, not day to day, month to month kind of things, but we've kept track of each other. It's pretty remarkable that, look, we've been in the same room, not very many hours, yet we feel real close. Why is that, man? Why is that?
I think, when people are going under some sort of stressful thing together, and while we didn't go down range together, we did do the training for that. Some of that was stressful in a good way, and some, the normal BS stuff. So, and I think those bonds are built up, and then we went and did very similar things down range. So you also left the wire with your notebook, suffering the slings and arrows of outrageous RPGs to get that information, get it back to the troops. So I think we definitely share that, and that's a bond.
Yeah, you're right about that. And people should understand, even though we went out, our job was not to be combatants. We were out there to collect information. In my case, I approach it more as a spy. You approach it probably more as an academic. But we're looking at trying to solve very hard problems. And the military is this reason why we were there was the military is this big, dumb machine that doesn't want to do what it needs to do. It wants to do what it does well and dominate land, that kind of thing. And here we are going, hey, here's how you might try winning. Here's the other things you might try doing. Is this, look, you're a historian, right? And you focus on the medieval times in terms of your book and everything else that we're going to talk about. Has this always been true? When you send your spies into the field, you want to know about the nature, composition, and size of your enemy. But also, look, if you got a bunch of Tory backing folks in town, you need to know that.
Yeah, before we go further on this one, I'm going to do that normal DoD disclaimer thing.
Oh, please, yes.
And say, of course, that anything I say here does not represent the position of Defense Department, Air Force, Air University, or Command and Staff College. But to answer your question, I think you always want to know what the human terrain is. Right? We talk about the geographic terrain, and I think the program is well named the human terrain because that's just as important. In our joint all-domain strategist concentration at Air Command and Staff College, we talk about the different domains, different fighting domains. One of those is the human domain. And all those other domains point to the human domain because ultimately that's where decision is created or not created. So even those sort of softer things that we were looking at, those may well be determinant in the outcome of a battle. Look at Ukraine as a good example. Nobody thought, given the military calculus, that they stood much of a chance. And yet here we are 5 or 6 weeks later, and they're still holding out. If anything, I think it's underscored. There's something that we don't do well as a force as yet, but it's something that I think that we have some routes forward. And we can definitely go into that on a different show in some detail because you and I share a great deal of synergy on that, plus some harmonic experiences that can come together to prove something pretty special.
Harmonic synergy? That's so good.
I get my buzzword bingo here, so I got.
Do the buzzword bingo thing. So I want to make sure I point this out too. The war has been basically 8 weeks old now. I mean, and that doesn't include like the pre-fight stuff that was happening. So it's been a long time, and it is a bit of a surprise. Going back further into time, back into medieval times, when these armies are running around, look, they just aren't that big compared to the population that they're surrounded by. So again, how does this compare to like what we did? Like if you go into a cluster of say 5 hamlets, there's more people than what you have in your army. There's just going to be, right? And not hard to overwhelm somebody. See, but they're also not combatants.
Well, this is like, okay, it's very difficult to overwhelm somebody flying over in a plane or sitting on horseback in, full armor. That's not going to happen easily. And, arguably that's where the analog is today. You've got somebody that's almost invulnerable to the folks around them, but with that sort of technological / knowledge ability comes duty that's bound to it to act in a certain way, which is
Mm.
where we get these sort of chivalric ideas, which is where ultimately our conduct of the officer and the gentleman, and also a lot of our international relations sort of rules come from. They come from that era and different ways of managing the violence, if you will, and managing the force disparity in a way that's less destructive than it could be
Mm.
with international rules and so on. Even if I tell guys that I'm teaching the martial arts stuff, even if you were kicking in a door in Kabul and going in with some of the soft guys, there are rules there too. It's not like just because it's war, there's no rules.
Right.
That is most decidedly not the case. So um, I think over a very long time, you can see it back in Thucydides. There were ideas about how this violence should be regulated and moderated that were observed probably as often in the breach as in the actual
Mm.
conduct, but at least that's the lines along which people were thinking, and some people adhered to it. So over time, I think we've gotten better about that. Perhaps the recent experience in Europe notwithstanding, but generally speaking, um, when the West has sort of led the way in warfare, those ideals, that long experience through medieval Europe into Renaissance Europe, the horrific period in the early modern 30 Years' War period, out of which came the nation state
Yeah.
system. All that stuff is designed to try and reduce the extreme violence that can come out of this stuff.
I want to tell a bit of a story, and I've told this before, but you know,
Yeah.
7 billion people probably haven't heard this story. So let's just tell it again. So when I was working in Baghdad, when I say Baghdad, Baghdad, the state of Baghdad in Iraq, and way out in the country, so nowhere near Baghdad downtown. We was a farming region. We were right on the border of another state to the south of us, and so it was just a quick, simple hop across the river, and you could be in the province of Baghdad. So we were looking at like the police and their impact and their effect, and having an understanding of was our police training working, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have this other system. So with the special operators that would come across the river to come and grab people. So the result was this: in the region, men, innocent or not, were sleeping outside of their home in ditches trying to hide out because they didn't want to get snatched up by special operations people.
Hmm.
And so this is bad because you're not building community. You're dividing community. You're creating
Yeah.
a lack of security by doing this. The other thing is like we're talking about this rule of law. Hey, we have to have rule of law and everything, and we were snatching Iraqis up, what amounts to illegally. We weren't serving a warrant, and by say we, I mean the Iraqi forces and their partner American forces. So we weren't serving the arrest order, and so the police lieutenant, who's all the way out in the middle of nowhere by himself, he's like, hey, could you guys stop doing that? Because I spend my whole day talking to families. I have no idea where your husband is. Could you let me know? Could you serve a
Sure.
warrant? Because all the information is going to be on that, right? And so we put this up in a report. Now, keep in mind, this is for everybody else. Brian will get this. Our report goes up, and then it goes up and over, and then it comes down to across the river. But that's 1,000,000 miles in terms of military authority. So the next person they snatched, they did serve a warrant. They served it by staking it with a knife on the kitchen table. And we're like, yeah. So when you talk about the rules and adhering to them and creating the outcomes we want, that is an entirely effed up situation. And because we're relatively insignificant on the battlefield because we're at the ground truth level, everybody else in this equation is pretty effed, because we're not getting what we want out of this. Does this resonate back to the olden times? Like these kind of problems where you're like, you have to understand more about the multi-domain nature of war. And has war always been multi-domain like this?
Well, right. Think of that Sun Tzu quote, right? Know yourself and know your enemy, and you'll win 1,000 battles. Now,
Yeah.
there's more to that than the fortune cookie sort of Sun Tzuism that you can pull out of it. Certainly, if war involves will, the way Clausewitz and Sun Tzu say it does, then certainly the popular will, whether you're interacting with them or attacking them directly, which of course they don't advocate, but has been done
Right.
forever, that does play into how that actually works out. Now, there was obviously, when they were doing that, there was some intent that they were after when they were delivering the warrant that way or when they were approaching that way. Whether or not that's in keeping with our sort of democratic values is another question entirely. I think the dynamic, the human domain element has always been there. And while society's changed somewhat, I agree with Thucydides, I don't think it really changes. And the causes of war, um, what is it, honor, interest, and fear, as Thucydides says, those things don't really change too much. How we do war, the character of war, that definitely changes. And so how the human domain interacts with the sort of armed power, the armed force, that does definitely shift.
Yeah.
Though there was a formal warfare in the 14th century, is an area that I studied, the 100 Years' War period, long period of warfare between England and France, more than 100 years actually. It's 1337 to 1453 or so. So we think the 20-year war was long.
Yeah.
This is 116 years at least. And they would, in order to try to goad the French out, they would go through and conduct a kind of warfare called chevauchée. And that was just basically a riding, is the French word for it. And you're going through and you're basically burning and pillaging stuff in order to draw the army out, because it won't engage otherwise. And we see this kind of presented with a somewhat friendly face in Henry V by Shakespeare, but that is the sort of image. Why won't they come and fight? Well, okay, we can damage them economically, as happened during the Peloponnesian Wars, or to some extent during this economic portion of the 100 Years' War. But it's also a move to affect the minds of the nobility, as well as the king, as well as the minds of the people you're running over. So yeah, it's not I don't like that aspect of it. Obviously, the sort of personal combat aspect is something that's very different and has a play within the smaller canvas of sort of the chivalric culture and the mutual respect across the lines that had in that period. I don't think anybody would advocate for the sort of unrestricted warfare almost that has governed most of warfare for a long time, with various people trying to make appeal. You got the idea of what a just war is coming in. You've got the peace and truce of God during the 13th century. Hey, we don't want any fighting on the weekends and so on, and please not in the villages and so on. Those kind of efforts, have been around forever. Look at the people of Ukraine trying to limit the warfare. And so I think that dynamic is always going to be there. People who advocate for and want limits, and then other people who say the war is without limits by definition. Even Clausewitz hints at that. He says true war is something that has, in its logical sense, has no limits, something that those Chinese colonels talked about in unrestricted warfare. So this is a problem that's not going to go away anytime soon. I think there are those who thought we would banish war, or had banished war in its more raw form. You and I know a little differently, but at least our experience has been different. But for folks sitting in a city somewhere that's never been close to war, I can see where that's an appealing concept. Certainly, it's appealing across the board. It's just probably not realistic.
Well, the desire to impose your will upon somebody to the point where they capitulate, and the actual outcome, those things don't ever line up. I mean, when my friends, they get riled up about political and civil war and everything, I'm like, you have to think about everybody you love, everything you own, all being gone. Is it worth all of that, or should we try talking some more?
Yeah.
Because once it happens, in a large part, there are no rules. Like a warlord is just someone who's fed up with the system and says, I'll just take my own destiny and the destiny of the ones I love who follow me into my own hands. And it starts with brutal barbarism, that just chopping of heads, shooting of faces, to impose their will upon a body of people. And then the government has to try to figure out if it can dig that tick out of the skin. And that's not easy.
Well, in a real sense, it's a competition for governance, right? So same as an insurgent goes out and creates competition for legitimacy in that area. That's what the warlord is doing too. Sometimes, with defensive modes in mind, but probably more often with less defensive modes or objectives in mind. There was a fellow that I was working with, very highly respected Afghan Kandak commander, a colonel, and he, I asked him a question one time. I said, "So, what are you going to do if that $4 billion in foreign aid coming in here stops?" He said, "Well, we'll return to my province, and we have caches, and we'll defend the province."
Yeah.
Very realistic. And I didn't get the impression that he was looking for that day to happen or was happy about it or anything else. It was just sort of a realistic fatalism that was, at some point this whole train's coming to a stop, and I'm responsible for my clan and my house, my village, and all that. So
There's so much I want to ask you about, but this is really for the next show. But I don't want to lose track of this point
Sure,
because
sure.
one of the, so our peers who work in the military side that are desperate and fetishize the violent aspect of it. Like, how many scopes can you have on your rifle? What can your rifle kill specifically? What weapons do you know? All of these things you can't make the Taliban show up. You just can't. They're not going to come out, right? And so you have all this desire and passion to build hyper capacity and target selection and all these other things. In reality, you and I know all you got to do is sit down with these elders and you'll realize how complex this battlefield is and how badly we're doing on it. And you know, one of my big things is affect over effect, right? If you think
Hmm.
affectively, then we can get there. These look at, and I love people that think that tanks matter and all these things still. And we're kind of seeing what happens when you lead with tanks right now. So all of these things kind of lead me to this question of when, and I want to take it back to the chivalric times and everything else. Are we, man, the Afghanistan thing is so tough because we did such a horrible job of preparing ourselves for the fight that was at hand, the fight that was offered, the fight that we needed to win. Again, we look at all these like we have to have more javelins, better javelins, you know. But if there's nothing to javel, you don't need a javelin. So let me just take this. I don't want to talk about Afghanistan too much because I really want to talk about your fantastic book. I'm just going to read the short title. Sword in Two Hands. Let me tell you something. Everybody listening, if you have someone that likes medieval stuff, knights, medieval martial arts, which is like, you know, pokey things and swords and helms and gloves and stuff like that, you have to get this book for that person in your life because it's gorgeous. It's packed full of knowledge, whether it's technique or history and everything else. Brian gave me a copy. I looked at it and went, this thing's incredible. And the next thing I'm going to do is give it to Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden because he's a fencer. He opens it up. This is what you have to hear. He opens it up and goes, oh my God, this thing's incredible. What's the link? I want to buy more. I want to buy some for my friends. Right. And
Nice, nice.
so here's a guy who didn't know this book was going to show up. It hits his hands and he instantly wants to buy it. Do you guys hear what I'm saying? Get Brian's book. It is fantastic. Even if you just put it on the coffee table, it's gorgeous. There's all kinds of illustrations and stuff with Brian in there. Thanks for writing the book, Brian. And I know that thing must have taken a lot of work because there must be 100,000 words in that thing.
Yeah, she's 280 something pages, I think, which amusingly is about half the size of my armor book, which is 600 and something pages. I write pretty fast though. And I wrote the bulk of this thing in 2006 and 2007, and it came out in 2007, was out for about 3.5 years. When I went to Afghanistan, I let it go out of print, and then other things intervened until recently Echo Point came back in the picture and said, hey, we'd like to publish this thing. I said, that's great. If you're going to do it, let's make some changes. Let's do a second edition. Because it's been a decade, so
right.
Learned a few, more than that. So learned a few things since then, in 16 years. So let's add a few more things in there. The bulk of it actually didn't change, but some of the details and some of the community stuff changed and things of that sort. So this is really a product of my normal approach, which is I want to know why the heck things work the way they do. And I work that out by writing it out. So some people draw pictures, some people talk it out. I tend to write it out. And that's how I get deep into the conceptual weeds, trying to figure out how these things work. So I always wanted to know why. I've been tournament fighting since 1981 or so. And the first thing I was interested in during the 80s is, hey, how does this fighting work? But we had no medieval references there for actual fighting technique. So we didn't know what they were actually doing. What we had a bunch of surviving examples of medieval armor and swords. And frankly, the fighting is just fun when you do it as a competitive martial art thing. The armor protects you, so you can hit full out as long as it's good armor, at least. And the chivalric sort of environment keeps it sort of not MMA and not sort of a boxing match where you hate each other. It's nothing like that at all. You're fighting with your buddy, and you're trying to push him as far as you can. So that sort of environment, really, really fun. Sort of what led to, I want to know why this thing works now. Why do these tournaments work? What's going on here? And that led me to this idea called what I call the renown mechanism, which came out of my readings of a bunch of medieval feats of arms and tournaments, largely from the 14th and 15th centuries. Right around the time that full head to toe plate armor was coming into fashion, these tournaments were also blossoming. And if you've seen The Knight's Tale, that kind of hints at some of it, some of the spirit, even though they add a bunch of modernisms in there. That's okay because they're connecting it to a modern audience. Perfectly fine in my book. A bunch of our folks were like, that's terrible. It's not medieval music. It's like, yeah, but it's how they saw their own music. So there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that at all. The fighting stuff, though, right? It's a martial art like other martial arts around the world. We're very lucky. In about the late 90s, a bunch of treatises were rediscovered. They were known earlier, but they weren't in popular circulation at all. And a few individuals during the 80s and 90s looked at these things, but nothing much came of it. I was focused on the tournament at that time. And then I began to see this sort of very early sprouting of popular sentiment. Hey, look, these medieval books exist and they tell us how they were fighting. It's like, what's this? This is interesting. I've already done that for tournaments and for armor, so let's go for the fighting technique now. And we got into it, and at first it was like, well, they're dueling, which is not the same as sort of friendly combat, but it's maybe an oxymoron, friendly combat. But the techniques look very interesting. They're all power based, as you'd expect, but also precision is very important. Because to get around the armor, you can't just bash it into submission. You've got to find the weak points. And so in addition to power, you also need precision. And the more I looked at these treatises, the more it was not just a collection of random techniques. It's like, wait a minute, there's actually a system underlying this that's potent and well thought through, which shouldn't be a surprise. These guys were doing it for a living in an era where you lived or died based on this. So of course it's going to make sense. Of course it's going to be efficient. There's no big circular movements. It's just moving from point A to point B, just as you expect in Krav Maga or, Systema or any of those other sort of combat-oriented martial arts, or Akajitsu for that matter. So this is Europe's version of that from the 14th century.
That's neat. So you basically are breaking down the actual systematic approach that they took to fighting in this way. And are there a lot of systems that have survived history? Like, like we always talk about like Mansa Musa being the most wealthy man in the world, everything else.
Right.
But you look at his images online, and it's a picture from Civilization, the game. Like it's not even like a real picture. And so that there must be. This is a wealthy guy. He must have had people recording things, fighting styles, or whatever it is, and
Maybe,
that's someone
yeah.
who's it's just, has that stuff survived? Obviously some of the Asian martial arts have survived, but
it's survived, but from later. So 16th, 17th centuries when you first start getting. Now I don't know why that is in Asia. I'm not really an Asianist expert, but it is curious to me that the best stuff we have from them is, after the Restoration and whatnot. It's like, holy crap, this is not at all what I would expect. There could be stuff buried in China that has not seen the light of day yet, or there's interesting Arabic stuff that's in Turkey and other of the surviving libraries. Mostly that's equestrian desert horsemanship and archery and things like that. It's still cool. It's still interesting. And there's some sword and buckler, some sword and shield things that survived from the Middle East. But oddly, in Europe, the earliest one we have is really from the 13th century. And it's a sword and small shield treatise where it's like a priest and two priests, really, a knight or a scholar and a priest, doing some sword and buckler stuff in a very odd, systematic way.
Right.
And seems like that might be an outlier, except that visitations, which are visits by archbishops and bishops by districts to see what they're doing right and wrong. It's like an IG audit. There are some of these where they record, oh, hey, we're finding them because they were fighting sword and buckler on the cathedral grounds. It's like in a church.
Yeah.
Huh. That's curious. So that's the first one we have, and it's not till the 13th century. And then at the end of the 15th century, we start to get some other books. But and there are two basic traditions in Europe. There's the Italian tradition with a couple of subsets and a Germanic tradition. You get a few things in amongst the British Isles and the French, but the fighting tradition manuals really come from those two places. Now, treatise is a better word than manuals, but and it's a little weird because you might expect there should be more, but if you figure, the fighting communities didn't learn to fight from books. They didn't send their kids to a city to learn. It was largely the best of the local combatants would teach the youngsters.
Right.
And that's where they learned it from. And there's no book involved in that. So this came about probably because you have more people from the cities and towns coming onto the battlefield during the 100 Years' War. And those people are bringing different traditions with them. So, hey, we want to learn to fight. I'm in a town, one of these German towns or an Italian town. I'm going to go down to the school in the Salda Army or the Kunsteffekt, and I'm going to learn to fight. Well, they're going to tend to record things like craftsmen did in books, which is not at all what the knights were. They did. The knights were literate and they had books, but we're talking romances and treatises on international relations and things like that. I think it's a different tradition, and we're lucky that it survives. Otherwise, we'd know only what survives in medieval art, which is not that much.
So I guess what you're saying is, even though like we have a manual based learning system, and Xenophon wrote about cavalry way
Right.
back when, you're saying that dudes like Charlemagne and Roland, those guys learned from whoever the world champ was at the time, because they've got the money to pay that dude to show them how to fight, and so they learned in a dojo for the most part.
Well, on a fighting field outside the castle grounds, right?
Yeah, and I'm saying dojo
but I think it's a little bit different because the dojos present like a very systematic approach, which is what I found in these treatises also. But my guess is it was much more catch as catch can until you get this urban sort of method coming in. And it's what we're talking about is technique in the Greek, which is really technique. And it's a systematic breaking down of principles and so on. I think that was a very different way than your average medieval knight really went at this. But starting in this early sort of late 14th, early 15th century time period, all of a sudden the number of books explode. Now, the earliest one records a mnemonic. It says, as the verse says, and then it gives you a gloss on that verse. So there was probably an oral tradition going back a few hundred years. Oh, look, here are the principles of the sword in two hands. Here's the principles of the long sword. And then some people may have used that as a teaching method to go forward. But I think it was prior to that, it was very regional, very localized, based on whoever the local person was to teach. And later, you start to get these people who come in with literary skills and a clientele in the cities that want to learn this way. And they say, okay, so yes, I can record this stuff for you in books. So Fiore, in his prologue, Fiore de Liberi is the Italian master that I pull most of this from. He says in his prologue, the introduction, which is kind of a resume at the beginning of the book, so you got to treat it with a little bit of a critical eye, but it says, I, Fiore de Liberi, who can read, write, and draw. And the implication is that he did this himself. I traveled to many foreign lands and learned from many dukes and barons and so on, and I'm recording what I learned, what is safe in this book. So for my lord the Marquis, so he can better learn the art of fighting. L'arte d'armizzare is what it is in Italian, literally the art of the use of arms. So that's his name for his martial art. And he records in there a series of techniques from unarmored grappling, better word than wrestling, a bunch of dagger techniques, sword in one hand, sword in two hands, spear, poleaxe, and then on foot and in the saddle, and then in and out of armor. So one sort of system. And what he did is he seems to have presented in a very systematic way that would probably synthesized what he had looked at and studied and said, look, here's what's really going on. Because he had the time to do that. Most nobles spend a little bit of time fighting and a lot of time governing or looking after their business interests. So it's a mix of local government, business, and sometime you're fighting, but that time, of course, takes away, and you're not fighting very much usually. So that time takes away from your business and your governance. So probably not the best use of your time. There's a 14th century Portuguese king, Dom Duarte of Portugal, who said, yeah, my advisors told me not to write this book. It's a waste of time. I have other governing things to do, but I like to train in fighting. I like to put my armor on, go run on the beach. I like to invite people over to fight. And every time I do that, my advisors go nuts because I should be doing other things. But it's important that you do it because one of your functions is defending the kingdom. So, so I think what was happening is you have a blend of cultures going on here. Fortunate for us because we get a systematic view as to what at least one person might have been saying was going on. And I got to tell you, it's efficient and effective. I taught it even to some soft guys in Afghanistan, and their sort of jaws hit the ground. It's like, this is really simple and efficient. It's like, well, I didn't invent it. It's actually been around for 500 or 600 years. I've just been interpreting it. So, so it's kind of an interesting thing, and you use it just like you use any other martial art, right? You use it to build character things as well as physical skills and endurance and all that. But it's really to get at the sort of character aspects, just like anything else. Yeah, the combat skills are useful, and I've had a couple of occasions to use them, but most people, 95% of people that are using it, are never going to have any reason to go after somebody with a sword or anything else. Maybe 99.5%.
Right.
And even if you did, that's only going to get you more in trouble with a jury. So that seems stupid. But everyone who does it can have the chance to go out on the tournament field and show their cool armor and their techniques and their courtesy and respect combined with their prowess and whatnot, to sort of show the whole picture. And the picture
Yeah.
is very similar to what I detect from officers who I teach on a daily basis. They're after very similar things.
Right. When you have someone, okay, so what would you say is the chivalric era? I mean, when does that begin and end?
Yeah, well, figure the fall of Rome sometime in the, 5th or 6th centuries,
Hmm.
um, all the way up to, and this is arguable, of course, but it's localized, depends on where you were. Sometime in the late 15th century, it kind of becomes the early modern era or the
Hmm.
Renaissance, depending upon what you're talking about. Now, of course, the Renaissance in Italy was much earlier, and really they didn't really have a medieval period the way that the rest of Europe did. And the medieval period that we think of being educated in sort of Midwestern schools and stuff is different than what was going on in Eastern Europe.
Hmm.
Um, but they were all interacting. And what some scholars like Maurice Keene have said is that, hey, there was an international kind of fraternity, if you will, or recognition of friendliness, if you will, across what we might think of as national or cultural boundaries.
Right.
It's like, hey, I'm fighting in a battle against you, but I may be related to you, and next week we may be on the same side. So I
Right.
don't actually necessarily want to kill you here. I'd
Yeah.
like to, demonstrate my superiority in battle so I can take you prisoner and such and make you pay a ransom. That's good. But I don't really want to kill him. Those ideas seem to have come up during that sort of chivalric period, chiefly during the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, or 15th centuries. So I'd run it maybe the 12th through the 15th is the core era. The Song of Roland is interesting, but it's it's interesting for people who like that era. It's not really what we're doing here. Most of these guys, of course, remember they're called knights because cheval means horse,
Yeah.
and so these are just horsemen, chevaliers, or and so chivalry is really the man in the horse in the saddle. And for a long time, that was just really expensive. So it's equivalent to having your own plane.
Hmm.
Now, a light plane, but still a plane. And
Yeah.
if you got a really good one, well, maybe that's an F-22. So with the full harness and all that, and it's just as maneuverable and just as difficult to beat as one of those birds is. So I think you brought up earlier, the technology thing. I don't think that technology is determinant,
Hmm.
but in some of these encounters, it matters if they can shoot farther than you or penetrate your armor that you spent all this money developing. So being behind can sometimes be really problematic. I
Hmm.
certainly agree that maintaining the larger picture. Should I even be fighting here? Is fighting the answer here? These are more valid questions. But
Yeah.
once fighting does come to be, then those things actually do make a difference. If I can see and hit him before he can hit me, or if my guys can defeat his by staying together tighter than theirs do, then I have an element of a tool of state for
Hmm.
force that they don't have.
Yeah.
And I think Russia's trying to prove that, and Ukraine's saying, well, the specific kind of technology you have actually does matter, as
Yeah.
does the training and motivation of the people involved on
Yeah.
all sides of this. So I think
Well, and that question,
these things
Russia
don't go
should have
bad.
asked itself, should we be fighting? Or
Yeah.
will we potentially look, NATO's not involved yet, right? And the moment NATO gets
Well,
involved, that
not
was
directly
direct.
involved, but
There's
yeah,
no Title V yet.
right.
But the moment that happens, NATO's never leaving the Ukraine. Like that whole Ukrainian area is going to have
Yeah.
NATO. Look, there's NATO forces and offices, and granted, it's a small footprint, but they're still in the Balkans, right?
Yeah.
And so that question,
Sometimes it's not that small. There's an aerial mission up there that's unclassified, and there's other things too.
yeah,
And of course, Russian people on Russia's side say, well, the West is once again encircling Russia and so on,
right,
with these
right.
alliances and so on.
And
China's, of
Iran.
course, thinks
Iran
it's
is
similar.
encircled too, right? Like we
Yeah.
definitely do this.
Yeah.
Let me
Well,
I want to get back to
and
another thing.
alliances do that. So yeah, go for it. Let's go back to the thing.
In the and I don't know the era specifically, but I'm fascinated by the Arabian version of these kind of things. And for
Yeah.
them, the F-22 was a horse for combat and a camel for support. And so
Hmm.
any good chevalier in the Arab world had both of these things, because the camel was this massive portage beast that can go
Hmm.
anywhere, and the horse pretty much had to walk until it was fighting time. But once you showed up to wherever you were going to fight, they had no ability to counter that because they couldn't afford horses. There weren't, these horse people all around, and
Right.
so they were unstoppable for the most part with this fantastic fighting machine.
Well,
And
it
here
happened
they are.
before with the Mongols and the chariot people
Sure.
before that,
Yeah.
right? So this idea of hypermobility combined with hard-hitting ability to leave. Now, most of the Arab horsemen were it's light cavalry, so
Hmm.
speed was more important than mass.
Right.
Europe was always lean. The Western culture has always leaned a little bit heavier towards heavy cavalry, even Byzantium, of course, right, and the
Right.
cataphracts and so on. So there's a mix, and how the mix is depending upon how you're going to fight. Lots of hit and run kind of stuff if you're fighting on the light
Yeah.
cavalry side. Your shorter bows. There's all kinds of interesting surviving references of, yeah, they had tons of bows, but they couldn't penetrate the Crusaders' armor. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
gives them a problem. And yet you see at the end of the Hundred Years' War, Edward III goes out and organizes his longbowmen to
Yeah.
wreak havoc on the French. That longbow had been around for 200 years. It wasn't the longbow itself; it was how you used it that made a
Uh-huh.
difference. So you set those guys up behind a defensible position, make them come through the mud and the spikes and all that. You're going to get a lot more chances to shoot. You're not going to shoot snipe the way we think of it now, but
Right.
you're going to put a lot of arrows in the air, much like
Yeah.
right with unrifled muskets and stuff. And some of those are going to hit people or horses or whatnot, and it's going to be effective. And
Yeah.
yeah, the idea that you have a small elite that goes forward and sort of carries. But I mean, that goes back to Egypt and before. It's
Yeah.
like, yep, and these are the people. The chariot people were the nobility and the aristocrats. Then the equestrian guys, right? The word equestrian,
Yeah.
equus in Latin, they're the elite military group there. And then the knights in Europe, it's pretty much the same thing. And then cavalry briefly, in tanks and stuff.
Yeah.
Now we've got the debate, well, do we even need tanks anymore? But this debate isn't new. In the
Right.
1973 war, that was the same exact argument was being had. Oh, look at all the tanks the Egyptians and Israelis lost. Clearly the missile's the way to go. And yet, 2000 or 1991, it's tanks that invade um, and kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and then it's tanks that go again in 2003, coupled with air power. So this is a tricky game, I think, and to
Yeah.
figure out
Yeah.
what the next thing is. Now we're talking multi-domaining and swarming. Okay, that's a totally different way of thinking about the problem.
Yeah, well, the war is becoming, dare I say, three-dimensional, where like you're always aware of what's above you in a combat patrol because you brief on that, but it's usually your stuff on your side. Now, if you have to think, in a true three-dimensional, because war for the most part is sort of two-dimensional, and I get it that we're in a three-dimensional world, but when
Hmm.
you're worried about, drones coming in from any angle, it's really multi-dimensional in that anybody has a camera and a video and can make something
Right,
happen, like
right,
record something, even that, like that
yeah,
misinformation or disinformation is powerful. I want to go back to this chivalric era though, because I'm desperate to talk to you about modern warfare, but I'm trying not to. I'm
is that
trying
like
my
May
best.
4th or something? Yeah, we're doing that too.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. We'll get all that. You guys definitely should check that out, and definitely get Brian's book. There it is, right there. There's the link. A
thanks,
Sword in
Pete.
Two Hands. Go to Amazon and grab that. You can also go check out some more stuff at medieval martial arts by going to that website right there. And how do you say that? Is it School of St.
Schola
George?
St. George, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Schola, like Latin for school, and then St. George.
Yeah, yeah. So there's so many questions. Armor was really good. Like in the movies, it's sort of portrayed to be a lot more fallible. And I guess if you only has to go through one time, the uh, the quality of armor and someone who is an armorer, that's an important task if you're a noble person going to go into battle or practice on the field for
Hmm.
funsies and all that kind of thing. I want to ask that question, but I also
Sure.
want to ask, because again, back to this camel and horse idea, really the camel is a ship because most of the Arab world is an ocean of sand that you have to get across with provisions when you get there. You don't want to show up just with the horse and
Yeah, I
tell.
agree with that.
Yeah.
Sure.
I don't know that knights did a lot of traveling. What was the effective range of a fighting unit in medieval
Well,
Europe?
yeah, here's the thing. Think about the Crusades, right? So they could
Mhm.
project to some extent,
Right.
but a lot of those projections were, I'm going to leave and go do this campaign. But most of the stuff was near to home. If you're talking about a basic feudal contract, it's defensive in nature and it's 40 days, and
Hmm.
then you're released from your requirement. Now, the long duration of the Hundred Years' War changed a lot of that, and there are exceptions everywhere in
Right.
Europe. But basically, you're not projecting very far, not because of supply issues, although that was an issue. Most medieval sieges didn't fail by storming the castle because you couldn't hang out there long enough for those guys to run out of food and water.
Mm.
You just couldn't afford to keep the force in the field that long. Remember, you don't have a money economy.
Right.
It's essentially a barter economy. So the ability of a regional noble or warlord to keep his force in the field is dependent on the amount of pillage they can get, or ransoms they can take. So the projection is not that much. But if you get on a boat, then the boat can take you all the way through the Med, all the way to the Holy Land. And that's how those things were done, of course. And that only goes on steroids in the 15th century when you get the caravel and the long sailing ship, the blue water ships, that now you can project around the world. That's where this ultimately leads. With armor itself, the armor is doing two basic things. One, it's saying, first, it is providing physical protection. Two, the quality of the armor and such is also saying, but even if you defeat me, I'm worth keeping alive because I can pay a good ransom.
Mm.
So I am worth a lot more alive than I am dead. And
Yeah.
since the point of most medieval battles was kind of like it is in local battles in Afghanistan, it wasn't to defeat them and kill them all. It was just to make them sort of retreat and pull back and
Mm.
lose battles. So that made our trainers, frustrated them in Afghanistan. But it seems to be the local way of war generally. It's like, well, why do I don't want to kill anybody? I don't have to because that can create a blood feud. So if I don't have to kill somebody, why would I? And the armor helps with that. The other thing it does is it means that you can go out and you're sort of armored up on horseback. The people on the ground have a little bit of armor, but not very much. And they don't fight very often. They have no training. So this is very much like a weekend reenactor. The few people that really train go out and just clean up, or the young bucks that are super fast and stuff, just clean up because the folks who only come out once every few months and put armor on a little bit and go fight, they just don't yet have the skills to stand up against that, except in mass. So
Yeah.
I think that was very much the same thing going on. And of course, it's trite, but it's true. The gunpowder ultimately puts an end to that,
Mm. Hmm.
because it can penetrate even the most dangerous stuff. And while you didn't have aiming, you put enough musket balls down there or harquebus
Yeah.
balls down there, it's going to hit my horse if nothing else, and then I'll be on foot, and that's not as good a place to be. I will clear up one thing though.
Mm.
Your basic what do you think the average harness weighs? Your full plate harness like you had on the drop leaf.
I mean, I'm just about to ask. So I want to ask a
Cool.
question after I give my question. Is
Yeah.
one of the big things that we all have to do is like every ounce matters, right? And for me, when I
Mhm.
was going into the battlefield, sure, I had my helmet with me, but I didn't wear it. I put it here as like a riding platform. So I took more notes than I
Hmm.
got in more
Sure.
firefights, right? And then I reduced myself down to basically a plate carrier because I didn't want to
Mhm.
have extra weight, but I could bring other things for the unit, whether it was ammo or water or
Right.
whatever it is. So what you carry is so important. So we love to see claymore swords out there, but if I'm traveling around, man, that thing's a pain in the ass to it's like carrying around a Barrett. Like
Yeah.
I've got this incredible weapon that is so powerful, but it
Mhm.
takes two people to carry it up a hill, and then someone's got to bring the ammo. Oh my God, that's so.
Yeah.
I want to ask about the weight that these things and what like were the ideal swords. But to answer your question, I would say that there is. I'll just go. It's comparable today. I'll say it's about 100, 120 pounds on a guy's back if he's got a
Okay.
full harness of stuff.
So when I was trying out for the Human Terrain team, they said, "So do you think you can manage to, you know, run around an entire day in battle armor?" It's like, yes, yes, I can. They're like,
Yes.
"Well, how do you know that?" It's like, never mind, it's not important.
Yeah.
Um, but
It's
the
so
the
funny.
Roman legionary was carrying about 55 pounds,
Okay.
with his armor, his helmet, his pilum, his swords, and all that,
Yeah.
bedroll, and all that kind of stuff. He didn't have ammunition to worry about.
Right.
He had some water and some rations to deal with. They weren't sort of as fetishy on water as we are. Um, your high medieval harness weighs almost exactly the same, 55 pounds, head to toe. It weighs about the same. Remember, these are mounted horsemen, though, in the main. So I'm not going to walk from my fob on the patrol all the way out in full harness. I'm going to ride there either on a non-war horse, protect the war horse until we get to the battle. Then I'll hop in his saddle. Or I may ride on the war horse, but my sword isn't on my hip. It's on his harness. So the horse is carrying that along with the shield if I've got one. So I'm sitting there, and mostly that armor is actually distributed at the waist and hips, and it's strapped to you. Unlike my army coat of, my pair of plates and stuff, which is basically all hanging from above, which the plate carrier is nice. That seems to work pretty well. But then you get the groin pieces and the arm pieces and the neck pieces. It's just they probably should have looked at medieval armor before they did that, because it's like, okay, I get what you're trying to do, but it's not doing it.
The cod piece, the diaper, all those goddamn things.
And I get the reasoning that people want to wear that. So I hear you. But it's not tenable. You watch the Taliban go running like little mountain goats up the hill, boing, 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 boing. It's like, I can't follow them. Even wearing a light battle rattle, I can't chase them.
You can't,
and it would be dumb to do so. But it's remained fairly constant until we added ammunition to the mix. Ammo is of course heavy, and you're kind of happy when a firefight happens on some weird level, because like, oh, thank God I don't have to carry this anymore. There you go. I'm just gonna shoot it all up. But it's mostly constant. The warhorse itself is doing a lot of the work in this. It is a partnership in every sense of the word. So you're creating a relationship with that horse. The horse is also highly competitive. Think of a bullfighting horse or something of that sort. And their horses were not the big plow horses that we see at the Ren Fair doing jousting and stuff. These are more like Andalusian or Lusitanos, sort of Spanish horses that can do all the high floofy stuff, and they are competitive as you can believe, and they're fighters. That's why bullfighting still exists there and in Mexico and so on. These horses are doing the same sort of thing. That's the nearest we have to medieval war horses on the European side. Arabs are still pretty close to what the Arab people were using during that era. They haven't shifted that much. So light and fast and smart. And a little prickly to deal with. That's how their mounts. And you want a horse that's going to have some personality when you're dealing with this thing, because I'm looking this way, dealing with an opponent or a threat over here. The horse may be looking the other way, picking up other things. It's almost like having a radar operator in the back of the plane. It's like, okay, buddy, my goose that I'm riding, right? Like, we're out here doing the thing. And I've had that opportunity a few times to do a sort of melee thing on horseback. And it very much matters if I have a Ferrari or if I have a VW. Which one I have makes all the difference, because the better horseman's going to be able to put himself where he needs to be on the battlefield, in front of, behind, or wherever. His horse will be a major part of that. If I'm a less good horseman or I don't have a good horse, well, I have a much greater difficulty figuring out where to go. The essence, though, is keeping the horses together and fighting as a group, just like it is on foot. If one horseman comes breaking through, that's kind of a problem, but you can deal with that problem. But if a whole bunch of them come shoulder to shoulder running you down, that's like an armored assault that we would have with tanks. Now, you're just not going to do anything about it unless you have an Apache. And that Apache was either a pike wall or gunpowder. So gunpowder spells the end of the horse. And except for the Afghan tribesmen, right? They still made use of it. So
it's a fascinating thing. Okay, I want to talk real quick. So I got you for a couple more minutes, and I got to let you go. But the sword thing, I want to get back into that. And then when you show up on the battlefield and you're trying to piece out who's who, obviously the guys that have armor on, you're like, okay, they're more dangerous to me than a farmer. But like, if you see like, oh my gosh, look at that guy's kit. He's, is he a rich guy that has money to get a bunch of stuff, or is he a container guy? You can sort that out, man. You
can sort it out by body carriage. You can instantly tell pretty much, okay, that SOB knows what he's doing. I need to watch out for that one. Especially, I like to start people off fighting with a spear. Spears are all around the world. Everyone uses spears to defend their village. Because it's easy. It's like playing checkers. Super easy
Uh,
to learn the principles. Put 3 or 4 people shoulder to shoulder and say, here, stand at the mouth of the village and don't let anyone pass.
yeah,
Okay, well, they can figure that out pretty fast.
yeah,
Swords much more complicated and stuff, but the spears do a lot of the killing. So you'll see a spear guy out there doing phenomenal work, and it doesn't matter if he's in good harness or not. It's like, okay, that one's got to go.
yeah.
So we need to take that guy down, however it is we're going to do it, or that group of guys who's really good at what they're doing. The armor does tell you a little bit. Historically, it would tell you more than it does now. And while you can't judge a book by a cover, if I'm taking ransoms, I can certainly tell that. As if the guy is really good, but doesn't have any fine or expensive harness, then I know he probably doesn't have any money. So ransoming him isn't going to be, there's no point to that. So we might just push him off the field or however you end up with it instead of trying to capture him. Swords themselves weigh less than you think. So 2 to 3 pounds is the max of what you're usually talking about for a sword in one hand. Slightly more than that, maybe a pound more for a sword in 2 hands. But even then, the idea is that it's a tool, you're going to use it all day. It weighs less than your M4. And it doesn't have any ammunition that goes with it except for your muscles. So you have to be able to use it for an extended period of time. So it's much more lively than you would think, but turning of the body in a very kinesthetically efficient way will let you convey a great deal of force, just like any other ball or stick sport. Think of the way a quarterback throws a ball, or the way you strike a hockey puck or a tennis ball. It's all the same thing. It's twisting of the body, turning the body, transmitting that through the weapon and into your opponent. And of course, the sword's edge does the work of concentrating all that power into a narrower front. They were a mix of sharp and unsharp, but it doesn't actually need to be sharp. And I don't need to cut through the mail or whatnot to hurt you. If I hit you in the head with a good shot, it's going to cause a reset for a couple of beats, even if it doesn't penetrate or give you a concussion through the helmet. That's going to give me time to get the point lined up and do something much more dangerous through the plates. And same thing, hands are small bones, knees are small bones. No matter how good your armor is, if I thwack you on the hand really well, that's going to cause a problem for you. And now I can continue to strike. So the precision does end up being important, but it's a blend of the precision and the power. Once these swords go away and you're dealing with rapiers and the fencing art, I don't need much power, because then all I have to do is go through your wool tunic or whatever. It's no big deal. But doing damage through your mail or your quilted armor or your plate, that requires both precision and power. So your sword should really just unlock that for you.
And then is it the case that, like, whatever, we'll say samurai swords were uniquely great, and if they had showed up on the battlefield in medieval Europe, it would have made a difference because of their, and I'm just saying, everybody loves
I get this question all the time. Who would win, the samurai or the knight? My answer for that is usually the better fighter would figure out much faster what the deal is. I don't think the samurai swords are any better, although, Japanese blade aficionados are probably howling at that, but I don't think they are. You can cut a cable with it, okay, but I don't fight a lot of cables. And armor works the same way that tank armor works, by deflecting the blow, so it bounces and goes somewhere else. A katana is going to do that. Katana is really optimized for hitting non-armored targets. You'll notice wherever they had armor, they had straight swords, because you're trying to concentrate power, not cut. I'm cutting, if you don't have steel or mail, then I'm trying to cut you. So a curved sword makes a lot more sense, which is why your Arabic guys are wielding primarily curved swords. So if it showed up in the battlefield, I think he would strike a few times, get some nicks, or not get nicks because the steel's really good. But he'd be looking for the vulnerable points just like everybody else, because you're just not going through it.
One quick question, and I'm really going to let you go. So when you go out in a modern battlefield and you can't carry enough ammo, because you can't carry enough ammo, like, the firefights are short, because what if there were 2? And it's like these things, you're 45 minutes away, but that's the entire firefight, right? So you're trying to figure out what you need to carry. What could knights not carry enough of? Like, what do they always need more of?
Probably water, but there's nothing like, if you break your sword, well, that's a problem. You'll break your lance or spear right off, because that goes away pretty fast, but it does allow you to project power further away. So you open with that, definitely. Just like you'd open with a long range shot and then close in as you get closer. Everyone carries a dagger. which is really a sharpened screwdriver. It's not a slashy weapon because you're trying to punch through mail and stuff. So think of it as a shiv or a sharpened screwdriver, and you're driving through the mail or whatnot. That's your final weapon. It's like, I broke my sword, I broke the lance. If I lose the dagger, well, I guess I'm grappling, aren't I?
Yeah.
And you might want to do that. The problem is in grappling, it's just like it is in modern combat, right? If I kick in a door and my M4 goes click, I actually don't want to grapple with the guy because I'd like my buddies to get in here and shoot him, or at least, stop him from shooting me.
Right.
So the last thing I want to do is actually close with him. He may draw a machete or something and come up on me. What I want to do is create space. So controlling that weapon, that shock weapon right off the bat, is the name of what this whole system is about. So it's not just spray and pray, it's control. So what you need more than anything else, I would say, is probably judgment. Even
Judgment. I love it. It always goes back to judgment and a whole lot of Sun Tzu. All right. So here, everybody, Brian Price, fantastic. There's the link for the book. It's called A Sword in Two Hands. It's available on Amazon or anywhere you get books. It'll be out there. It is awesome. I promise. All right. Stand by for 1 sec, Brian.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you.